and many other things. So you all know very well Dan, and then we is going to talk of a very crucial topic for me, and I think for every one of us, which is connected to his more popular idea, that is the narrative practice hypothesis, but then wrote at least a couple of gorgeous books on enactivism and lots of other great papers that I'm sure you have read. And but you know, the narrative practice hypothesis, as Dan used to say, is like the satisfaction for the Rolling Stones for the actors. So we are very, very happy that he wants to share with us a paper on these crucial topics and connected to mental health. So the title is Narratives and Mental Health, Narrative Therapy and the Fictive Stance. So then thanks a lot for being here for your presentation and for waking up so early every time we have this series of seminars. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claudio, and to all the organizers of the event. It's a fantastic thing that you've organized here, and I'm very glad to be a part of it. So just to say before we kick off, this particular piece of work is destined, I think, for a collection, an edited collection, but hasn't yet come out. But it has floated around on the internet a bit, and some people have responded to it. It doesn't make direct use of the narrative practice hypothesis as such. In some ways, in the background, it does make more use of a related idea that I have put forward in other places called the narrative self-shaping hypothesis, which is a modest proposal. But we'll see as that we go along. None of those things feature very centrally. I'm going to be looking more at some very general claims about the nature of narratives and their capacity to make a difference to our mental health, and I'll explain as we go along the structure. So let's turn to it. I want to first identify a few very broad claims that are hanging around in the background that people might want to challenge as we get to questions and answers. So first is just the broad idea that narratives have a certain power for us, that they're not epiphenomenal in any sense. This may not be so controversial, but the idea here is that the way we narrate our lives and how we make sense of who we are and why we do what we do matters to our mental health and well-being. You'll see in a moment that I don't claim it exclusively matters, but it matters, is the core assumption that I want to be operating with here. That may be also challenged. So hold on a second. So narrative practices, I think, if that's right, can promote mental health. And I think we have evidence that this is the case, that the way some people narrate their lives can empower them and can help them to cope resiliently when it comes to dealing with specific challenges and overcoming certain impediments. So narratives can have positive effects. I think there's a lot of evidence of this, which I won't be dwelling on here, but just en passant to say, we see this with narrative exposure therapy that has been used to treat trauma in refugees and to prevent psychiatric illness. We see it in mentalizing focused interventions that have shown the long-term effectiveness in the treatment of things like borderline personality through what I would elsewhere describe as folk psychological narratives. And arguably we see it too even with the use of social stories developed, say, by Carol Gray in 1991 to assist individuals with autism spectrum disorders to develop a greater social understanding and a much more particularized one. So this is some of the uses that we've seen, that narratives, very varied uses in mental health domains. But we also have seen evidence that narrative practices can derail mental health. That the way we narrate the way that some people narrate our lives, or the way we narrate our lives, can disempower us or make us less able to cope, sometimes dramatically, and leading in some cases to depression, despair, and in the very worst instances, death. It would be incredible to suppose that only narrative practices matter to mental health, and that our narrative practices alone and on their own matter to mental health. So that is not the claim that I'm looking at here. The proposition under scrutiny at the moment, or for this presentation, is far more modest, that narrative practices can make a difference, and sometimes a pivotally important difference to our mental health, whether positively or negatively. And if that's the case, then they deserve special attention. To illustrate the more modest claim, we can hold that in addition to many other factors that say influence something like addiction, and there has been work on this, quote, the agent's self-narrative also has an influence. And if that's the case, or let's treat that as a working assumption, what might account for such an influence? How should we understand it? It has been hypothesized that the narratives we weave about ourselves significantly impact on our capacities for self-governance. And it's that's supposed to be the reason for their being capable of making a difference in these domains. So what follows for this presentation will come in 3 acts, and I'll explain each of the functions of the 3 acts. So, you know, the first one is the longest act, and the second 2 get progressively shorter. So don't worry if you're losing your consciousness in the background. Act 1 offers a philosophical analysis of how narrative practices can influence mental health, focusing on McConnell and Schnoke's account of the role that self-narratives play in recovery from addiction. So I'm going to look very closely at what I think their account is and all of its plausible features. And once we've done that, I'm going in Act 2 to detail 3 skeptical challenges that cast doubt on whether narrative practices of the sort described in Act 1 can or should be used to influence mental health. So they pose a challenge to what would be a first pass possible explanation of how that works. And in Act 3, I'm going to show how it is possible to address that trio of skeptical challenges introduced in the second act if we rethink and explicitly restrict the sorts of narrative practices we use when seeking to govern and shape ourselves. So there's going to be a positive suggestion about how, not merely a descriptive account of what's going on, but how we might approach the use of narrative practices in mental health that would avoid the standard skeptical objections. So that's really the structure of this talk. So let's turn to the first act, narrative practices in addiction recovery. So I'll focus on this account because this is the phenomena that McConnell and Schnoke themselves focus on. So let's take that out of the way. So McConnell, in a number of papers, and then again co-authoring with Schnoke in 2018, provide a philosophical account of how narrative practices make a difference to our mental health. And they focus on cases of successful and or failed attempts to recover from addiction. In doing so, they embrace some fairly standard philosophical assumptions about the role narratives play in 2 things, our self-understanding, and for them, our self-constitution. And it's well known that attempts to recover from addiction have mixed results in the general populace. The question they ask is, why so? And their proposed answer, or rather part of an answer, is that they maintain that an addicted person's self-narratives play a critical part in whether or not that person will be able to successfully recover from addiction. They hold in particular, quote, that existing forms of addiction treatment will tend to be more effective and efficient if they are complemented by narrative-focused interventions for that reason. So the idea here again is this is not the whole story of what drives addiction, and that would be far too ambitious, but that these play an important component. Based on the findings of qualitative studies conducted in Sydney, They identify self-narratives as a key factor, which helps explain why certain individuals do better or worse in their addiction recovery efforts. They hypothesize that people who are more successful in their addiction recovery efforts reliably manage conflicts that arise between threads in their self-narrative that highlight recovery goals and threads which highlight their proneness for continued drug use. That's the core phenomena of interest. So, according to the proposed explanation, a person's recovery prospects are importantly influenced by their ability to accommodate and smooth out conflicts that arise between competing threads in their self-narratives. Now, in the background, one very important feature of this, which draws on some of McConnell's earlier work, when they flesh out this explanation, they propose what I'll call a sense maximizing thesis. And if anybody ever knows me, I'm very fond of three-letter acronyms, so we'll use SMT for sense maximizing thesis as we go along, if you can hold on to that. The proposed explanation leans on McConnell's account of what drives us to enact certain narratives. Given a certain self-narrative, some futures make more sense than others, and we are inclined to enact our self-narratives so that they make more sense. So it's this maximizing sense proposal that he thinks really drives the phenomena. So the sense maximizing thesis, or SMT, predicts that we will prefer self-narratives that best fit what a person takes to be the pattern of their life. And in a mutually reinforcing way, the SMT predicts that we will tend to enact narratives in our lives that better fit a dominant self-narrative. And so these things loop together. Accordingly, this helps us explain why some people fail to recover from addiction, despite sincere and concerted efforts. They are, quote, inclined to continue their disvalued drug-using lifestyle because it nevertheless makes the most sense, given who they understand themselves to be. Okay. There's also operative in this a co-authoring constraint that's rather important. Other people in our lives play a big part in determining which of our self-narratives become the most dominant and established. The sense maximizing thesis assumes that determining which self-narratives make the most sense of who we are isn't a solo or a solitary project, and this can have important effects. Now, this is a big topic, but there are at least two senses in which co-authoring occurs. One is kind of much broader and in the background. So in the first sense, we draw on ambient, co-created and co-sustained sociocultural archetypes and tropes in order to make sense of our lives and actions and experiences. And I've written a lot about that, and that is very much ingrained into the basis of the folk psychological narratives, or the narrative practice hypothesis, sorry. Second, others play a more direct and immediate role in determining which self-narratives we find credible. This is because we look to others to confirm which narratives they think best and most accurately apply to us. So we're co-authoring in a whole number of ways at once, but it's the second way that probably has more force in maintaining an individual self-narrative in particular moments of their lives. Co-authoring is at work wherever individuals come to, quote, strongly identify with the aspects of their self-narratives that are consistently verified by others, so these authors claim. According to McConnell and Snoke, the trouble is that when trying to recover from addiction, the continual influence of others can push some individuals to conservatively identify with established, though disvalued, self-narratives in their self-narrating efforts. Another factor that will be important, perhaps, and this will get more kicked about in the discussion, is that background beliefs also act as an important constraint here. The addicted person's best chance of success in recovery is to find more factually credible threads to weave in with the older threads, thus creating a stronger, new, and preferred overall narrative, so the thought goes. But in that respect, a person's background beliefs can impede their ability to establish such new narrative threads. Ones, for example, that are plausible enough to integrate into a new self-narrative that would aid their recovery. So, for example, essentialist beliefs about the fixed and unchanging nature of selves could lead an addicted individual to wonder how someone of their type, someone with apparently fixed tendencies, could ever really change and recover. So if you have that sort of background belief on this account, it might it might frustrate your sense maximizing efforts in a way that prevents you from developing a new narrative for yourself because of this constraint. So background beliefs of this stripe can obviously fuel debilitating and disempowering negative cycles of self-doubt. Okay. So the crux of McConnell and Snokes' explanation of the role of self-narratives play in failed recovery is ultimately put in terms of a conflict of values. They write, quote, "No matter how much one explicitly values recovery, one also values the things implicitly represented by the established self-narrative, diachronic agency, self-knowledge, and social inclusion." So just to give this a little flesh, let's look at an example that they use, the case of Nicole, which was one of the patients in the studies that they conducted in Sydney. An incident at her practical examination seriously challenged the truth of her recovery-directed narrative, they write. This time, she did not have the mental resources to continue to try and convince herself and others that her recovery narrative was still true of her. She could much more easily explain her failure by incorporating it in her more established addiction self-narrative. That's her old self. Now, assuming the sense-maximizing thesis, if we assume that, the only positive way forward for addicted people is to find a reliable means of doing exactly what Nicole failed to do in that instance, which is to integrate various conflicting threads in their overall self-narrative and bring those together. The prospects of successful integration depend fairly directly on the addicted person's ability to deal with and diffuse an established narrative that they prefer to revise. Quote, "Whether a new narrative thread is ultimately integrated more permanently in the wider self-narrative depends on successfully enacting it and convincing others of its truth." An addicted individual seeking to change and recover, therefore, needs special narrative strategies and tactics. They could, for example, include, such tactics might include, for example, drawing on classic narrative tropes and archetypes such as the redemption script when telling their stories. Only if old narrative habits and tendencies can be kept in check will the new narrative threads have any chance of being endorsed and inactive. According to this proposal, the core processes by which a person becomes persuaded of a new self-narrative's viability depends on its responsiveness to the truth, and the way that these authors put it, it must stand up to the facts. The self-narrative that makes the most overall sense carries the day, and it's the one that is accepted and endorsed as capturing the truth about the person in question. Thus, any stable new self-narrative thread must cohere with the wider set of a person's established self-narrative threads, and any stable new self-narrative thread must be intersubjectively verified. So these are claims, these claims about coherence and intersubjective verification are made by these authors themselves. Now, with all that in mind, they think that narrative therapy holds out an interesting possibility to enable a person to master techniques that would allow them to reauthor their lives and weave a new overall self-narrative with freshly established ethic credentials. The main aim of narrative therapy is to help people get beyond reliance on thin, off-the-shelf narratives, enabling them to tell richer stories about their lives that are perhaps in some sense more accurate. Ideally, narrative therapy restoring results in an increased, as these authors like to put it cutely, responsibility enabling people to become more able to respond to a new set of circumstances, better able to cope. That's the idea. And as White puts it, who is the founder, one of the key founders of narrative therapy, quote, as people become more narratively resourced, they find that they have available to them options for action that would not have otherwise been imaginable. Now, in the best cases, when the therapy works, the result is that a person's revised and preferred self-narrative becomes credible and dominant and becomes stable. In such cases, the new self-narrative provides some basis, quote, some basis for imagining realistically achievable projections. Again, the emphasis here that I want to focus on is the focus on realism, that these are credible and factually verified. Right, so that's the first part. That gives us a sense of what I think to be, on the face of it, might be a quite plausible proposal about how to make sense of what's going on when we author our episodes in our lives, and how we might reauthor those to get a more preferred self-narrative that works to help promote our mental health as opposed to derail it. Okay. I'm going to raise 3 standard challenges that could be directed, and each of these I think would hit hard against the account that I've just given. And then after that, I will make a proposal about how we might avoid these challenges by rethinking what the core narrative practices might be in these kinds of efforts, and particularly in these kinds of therapies. Okay, so these challenges, some of these may be relatively familiar, but they're pretty standard challenges that push against the idea that we're going to get a account of the sort that we just talked about in a reliable fashion. So the first, I'll call it the explanatory challenge. Some of our narrative practices aim to provide us with true and verifiable self-narratives, as we just saw, telling us who we are and why we do what we do. But, so the skeptic says, our narrative practices simply cannot achieve that ambition. Simply put, to the extent that a narrative practice is conceived of as a truth-seeking enterprise, it must fail. It must be destined to fail. This will be so if, as a general rule, narratives, including factual narratives offered by historians, are incapable of getting at and settling on the truth of things. So if we have really skeptical doubts about that capacity, we're going to worry about anyone's account to get a verified narrative of the sort we were talking about in the previous section. So this has been, it seems, almost fanatical attention has been given to this by Alex Rosenberg, and it's really the centerpiece of his 2018 book, How History Gets Things Wrong. Rosenberg argues that those forms of history that employ narratives are simply unable to supply explanations that meet required standards of truth. He argues that whatever historical narratives supply, it is, quote, not enough to understand anything, let alone the best or only way to understand anything. For him, the root trouble with all so-called narrative explanations and truth-seeking explanations is that they are irredeemably indeterminate. And this is a familiar move in philosophy that you can see with Quine and Dennett and others. Quote, they fail to identify the real causal forces that drive events. So if we're trying to establish the true narrative of a person's life, the idea is, just as in history, of true narrative of a particular episode of events, to the reason why someone did something, the true reason, we face the same kind of problems of multiple interpretation. There's lots of possibilities, but we haven't got a way of adjudicating which of those is the true possibility that explains. As he says, there's no empirically established method for choosing between rival narrative possibilities. Hence, there is no scientific basis for deciding once and for all between them. There were at least no objective basis. This is why, quote, for him, science is not stories, it's theories, laws, models, findings, observations, and experiments. Now, I'm not going to delay to anyone who's thinking as I'm saying this, won't this also apply to all of those things? That may not be, that's a different discussion. And it may be that theories and models suffer the same kind of problems and fate. However, the issue here is just whether or not this criticism accurately applies to our narrative endeavors. For Rosenberg, when it comes to evaluation of their truth-revealing prospects, the inevitable conclusion is that, quote, all narratives are wrong in the same way and for the same reason, right? They just don't get at truths in any determinate way. His ultimate complaint can be universalized. It's not just obviously about history, it's about the use of narratives to make any kind of explanation. And as he puts it here, the demand of interpretive disciplines that account for ideas and artifacts, actions and events in terms of their meanings is part of the insatiable hunger for stories. And he thinks the whole lot needs to be condemned. Contrast this with his claim that the best descriptions of reality don't come in the form of stories with plots. Quote, our demand for plotted narratives is the greatest obstacle to getting a grip on reality. So there's a lot of very strong claims here. But to sum it up, that poses a serious challenge if we're going to give an account of maximizing sense that relies on getting accurate narratives about ourselves, if that's central to the story we want to tell about how narrative practices might promote mental health. Okay, we also face, which is very familiar to anyone in this territory, a scope challenge. Assuming that everyone has the possibility to reauthor their self-narratives is inappropriate for certain individuals and populations. Any proposed account of the role of narratives might play in mental health is vulnerable to this challenge to the extent that it commits to conceiving of persons in terms of strong, quote, narrative self-constitution views. Strong narrative self-constitution theorists hold that narrating our lives or experiencing them narratively, even if that only happens implicitly, is necessary for being a person. And this claim has been strongly challenged in the literature, and particularly by Galen Strawson, as we'll see in a moment. But you see it everywhere. It's a very popular theme. Here's a poster. Every patient has a story. Tell us yours. If that's the opening assumption, then the only mechanism available that we're focusing on is going to have limited scope. If it's not true that everyone does this, or that it's this implicit narrativizing that makes us people. Strawson very strongly has argued this for a very long time. He claims that although some people have narrativizing tendencies when thinking about their lives, not all people do. There exists, he thinks, a range of possibilities for temporal self-experience, and not everyone tends to experience or live or see his or her life in a storied way. If Strawson's right about this, that presents a scope challenge about, at the very least, the applicability of narrative-based therapies. Now, that might just be something one can accept, and I'll make that claim at the end. I think that's just something one could take on the chin, but you can't take on the chin if you buy into a self-constitution view of personhood in a strong sense at the very basis of your explanation for how these therapies work. So you can see why the scope of challenge has bite against the proposal that we looked at in the first section. And finally, there is the manipulation challenge. The reauthoring techniques employed in narrative therapy risk potentially unethically manipulating people by encouraging them to re-narrate past events in ways that may be truth distorting. Narrative practices that get us to review our past are especially vulnerable to the dangers of manipulation if they use guided imagination exercises to prompt clients to revisit significant events from their past with the intent to reauthor them. So decades ago, Loftus reported findings which revealed that, quote, many individuals can be led to construct complex, vivid, and detailed false memories via a rather simple procedure. The process works, as she says, by means of imaginative inflation. The person is asked to imagine a childhood experiences that did not happen to them, and the mere act of imagining the detailed episode increases confidence that it actually occurred. And there's been some pretty robust empirical work in this domain, initially using things like false photographs of the ones you see pictured here, superimposed into a real photograph, superimposed into another to present the subject with the idea that they and a family member have taken a balloon ride, and people are immediately pulled in and start to confabulate pretty easily about these past experiences. It turns out, in further studies, I like the quote of the title of this paper, actually a picture is worth less than 45 words. Narratives produce more false memories than photographs do. So when they redid these experiments using just narratives without the pictorial element, they got an even stronger result. So just describing and imagining these sorts of events, it has an incredible pull on us. Okay, so now I'm in the home stretch. All right, so let me just pause for a second. So we have a fairly plausible first pass analysis, but one that incorporates a lot of assumptions about self-constitution and how we get at the alleged truth of a narrative in order to make it stable, that is threatened by a number of philosophical objections and skeptical challenges. So what I'm going to do here is sketch something, and this is genuinely a sketch. I want to propose what I think is maybe a way out for narrative therapists, and maybe a way of even organizing these practices that doesn't commit us to understanding how they work, or rather maybe even reconceiving how they work a bit, so that we can avoid the skeptical challenges I just raised, but hopefully without loss of the power of the therapy. And perhaps people will come back in questions to ask or challenge me about whether certainly the latter is possible. I think it's going to be pretty evident that the move I make here will block the challenges. The question is, can the practices in question survive? I think there might be a good chance of that, but I'm willing to hear what people have to say. Okay. So the question I want to ask is it possible to update the official story about narrative therapy's aims and methods so as to avoid the trio of skeptical challenges, or put otherwise, to update McConnell and Schnook's philosophical account of how the narrative practices that we use even in everyday life work, so it doesn't have to always be channeled through narrative therapy? Is there a way to change or think differently about how those work, or maybe even alter those practices in explicit ways so as to avoid the challenges? The recommendation on the table that I want to put on the table is that narrative therapy could benefit or would benefit from officially adopting what Goldie calls the fictive stance. So within the fictive stance, a narrative is regarded as fictional, but not, quote, in virtue of its contents being false, but in virtue of its being narrated and read or heard as part of a practice of a special sort. Ergo, when we tell fictions quite deliberately to others, we're not lying, we're engaged in a different sort of practice, and the content within the fiction is often regarded as true within the fiction, but it is bracketed in this very important sense from making claims about the actual world. We adopt the fictive stance when we treat what is purported to occur in a narrative non-factually, as in make-believe, as we do when pretending or entertaining a possibility within certain storytelling practices, where it's really explicitly or known to everyone that that's what's going on. Philosophers take special interest, as I said, in the question of how to make sense of truths within such fictions. I'm not going to delay over that here. I think that's an interesting topic, but that's not our focus. For our purposes, the question is, can we explicitly adopt the fictive stance in successful therapeutic narrative practices? Can we frame our therapeutic storytelling activities so that the question of the factual truth or falsity of the narratives in question is bracketed, doesn't even arise? So let me flesh that out or make that a little more real, because by making a connection with other sorts of therapies that abound, that I think do use narrative practices, but they don't use them with an aim to get at someone's true story or give a true account of oneself. There are special advantages, I think, in thinking of narrative practices that confer therapeutic benefit as operating in an explicitly fictive mode. And I think that narrative therapy might benefit from explicitly endorsing the fictive stance and hereby taking a leaf out of the solution-focused brief therapy, or SFBT playbook. Solution-focused brief therapy is a therapy that doesn't try to reauthor a person's life. It rather focuses on improving their responsibility, to echo that earlier quote from David Denborough when he talked about the function of narrative practices, but does so by simply getting them to imagine and detail certain possibilities about the possible futures, and thereby focuses on solutions, not past problems. A key device in the solution-focused brief therapy handbook is that it asks clients to imagine a future in which their problem has been miraculously dissolved. They don't even spend any time describing how that could have occurred. Solution-focused brief therapy asks clients to describe in increasing detail what would be different for them and about them in that imagined future scenario where their problem had vanished. And in this respect, solution-focused brief therapy, quote, spends very little or even no time on the origins or the nature of the problem. And it doesn't dwell on questions about whether these, obviously, given what I just said, whether the future narrative is a proper reflection of the person's true self. So that's an example or a model of rather that using talking cures to define and establish a truth-based self-narrative, therapists could seek to, quote, reverse that polarity, focusing instead on, quote, constructing a future trajectory rather than achieving past accuracy. Should it prove feasible for us to adopt the fictive stance in narrative practices aimed at promoting mental health, no question would then arise about the accuracy of the imagined scenarios deployed in our efforts at self-reshaping. What we're imagining is some deliberately and explicitly designed future possibility, some future scenario about how things would look for us, and how things might be for us, how we would want to be, as opposed to focusing on what we really are and establishing that through by verifying this in any way. Notice that the explanatory challenge and the manipulation challenge simply drop away. If you explicitly frame it in this way, it's not as if we're revisiting our past events. There's no risk of manipulation in that regard, nor are we facing an explanatory challenge because we're no longer trying to establish that the narratives in question have truth credentials. And I think, in a sense, so the scope challenge can also fall away. For if you restrict ourselves to employing the fictive stance, we need make no commitment to any strong narrative self-constitution view of persons. Indeed, I don't, but it's entirely possible to think that this might function for some parts of the population and maybe not others. But the scope challenge is not then posed as a challenge about some underlying commitment to the idea that all selves are narrated implicitly or otherwise. And that's actually where I think I will leave it, and I'll take up in discussion why people think that this idea may be problematic or otherwise plausible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay, so I just have to figure out how to end this show. I'll get out of my... oh, there we go. Okay.
Thank you so much. So now we have lots of time for questions, interventions, ideas, and curiosities and all that. So just click the end at the...
Okay, I'm just trying to find
yeah,
okay, there's leave. That's not what I want. I want this. Yes. Sorry. Has that hasn't stopped sharing yet, or has it?
Yeah, it does.
It has stopped.
Yes.
I think
Good.
you're okay.
Good.
So there are questions for that?
Let's see.
There is Antonella. Antonella, please feel free. Hello and welcome.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can,
Well,
thank you.
yeah.
Perfect. Thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting. I have a question regarding how do you think that a different narrative practice or a different narrative self could reshape behavior, an addictive behavior?
Yeah.
I'm asking these especially because I think that we are all used to think about addictive subject having automatism, desires or passion maybe that they cannot resist. Mm-hmm. And maybe this kind of behavior also depends on unconscious narratives that they have internalized or some kind of emotions, I don't know. And so how do you think that in successful examples, different narratives could act and reshape this behavior? And if you think that there could be limitations on how this could happen and variability depending on the consciousness or the unconsciousness of the behavior?
That's a great question. And in fact, I mean, it points to the thing I raised at the very beginning. Of course, as I said, and including these authors, nobody's suggesting that this is the primary basis or factor for bringing about change in these cases. And what they were saying, if you recall in the beginning, I was saying that they thought that these can make a difference. They might make even a pivotal difference, right, in some cases. So people who are on the road to recovery, I think it looked a lot more often like, to be honest, that it made the difference usually in the negative direction. Maybe that's that they get pulled back out of a trajectory because they're slightly fragile. So if you imagine this as being the tip of an iceberg, but imagine that tip sometimes, like all that you said, could be in place, but still that practice could make a difference or might matter to the stability of somebody's efforts over time, right? So if it's even just one other further factor that could enter into a larger mix, it's worth noting and seeing how often or in what conditions. Like, I haven't done the empirical work, that's not my gig. In any case, though, and here's the interesting thing. So the bigger question would be, I think the bigger for what I was suggesting is if I broke faith, as I was suggesting, with the standard story that they were offering because of the challenges and the need to avoid those challenges, would there still be a way that these other explicitly fictive, right? So you're not even making the effort to pretend that this is your true self, right? Your self-narrative. You're not trying to verify it. You're simply imagining possibilities, right? Would that still work? Here's why I think, and I didn't say this in the presentation, I think that could actually, maybe it won't stabilize long term, but just imagining things may reset your emotional status. It may reopen up possibilities for you. Yeah, it may enable you to take even first steps in enacting a different path, which gives you the opportunity to change your directions. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a cure-all or anything of that kind. The point might be in the same sense that if that's a possible device that you can use to shift people's mindsets, this ties in very much with the radical enactivist view that you could actually, change emotional and motivational states that are not fully conscious, even just by imagining something by an explicit active imagination. So, I mean, I have seen this live actually, because I did go to a few of these therapy sessions that solution-focused people were using, where you could try it on yourself. If you imagine a happier scenario where you don't have all the problems that you currently have about your future life, it does uplift people's, general demeanor right in the moment, and that can change your motivational ability to focus. Whereas a lot of people dwell with negative thoughts, right? They don't find that they can push through those. So I'm not offering this as like a solution to addiction. That's not the idea here. The question is a more modest one. Can these narrative practices help in recovery from addictions? And there, I think that it's much more plausible that they can make some difference, even if it's only at the margins, but maybe sometimes very important differences to individuals and their ability to carry on. So that would be my answer. I don't think that it's a multi-level thing. So these interactions with how we think about things might make a difference even at other levels that are more unconscious. So I think there's an interactive profile there.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Antonella. We have John Sykes.
Thank you for that very fascinating lecture. I just had one very quick question. So you cited the famous body of literature which shows how easy it is to implant memories, which I guess goes all the way back to Freud.
Yeah.
But is this an epistemological flaw, say, in grounding the theory of self in narrativity? But could it be a flaw regarding the efficacy of therapy? Because you could say that, well, the degree to which the content of narrative structure is flexible, that attests to how easy it could be for the therapist to guide the client or patient into more productive narratives.
Yeah. Really great question. And I think that's why I pushed it into the fictive, right? So I absolutely think that's right. So I think that the risk of the whole thing is it doesn't seem, once you think about it, as you kind of picked up, pushing and changing, especially, and a bit in the paper, which I didn't emphasize in the presentation, is we often don't, and Loftus picks up on this too, right? We don't know what the truth of our past was. Nobody else was there to verify it in most cases. So vast swathes of what we're talking about, we're just guesstimating or hoping that we have an accurate depiction. That's like a skeptical meta-induction should be in play here. We know how miserable people are at getting things right, under controlled conditions. So the chances that we actually remember our episodic past is, although we like to talk that's part of the practice. We pretend that we do because that's part of our self-identifying activity. So I think you're right that in all of these cases, even with ourselves, and I suppose, okay, I'll give you a secret to the background of the presentation. So the thing that really got me excited is the background belief that we're stable selves, right? Which ties in with the idea that we can identify which one is the true self. And I don't like that thesis. So I guess that I think that you always have maximum possibility to be, to develop and create whoever you are at any given moment. And the fictive model, rather than the standard one assumed in a lot of therapies, takes us out of that domain. So it just opens up the idea that if the therapist is saying to you, let's just bracket like the solution focus, let's just throw away, like I don't need to know all that. What I really need to know is how I come back to the previous question. How am I going to get you into a better mindset that's more functional for the future? Here's a way, let's imagine, so here's another way of doing it. Let's take the past event and I say to you, imagine you handled it differently. Not that you did, right? Let's just imagine you could have. So I don't have to, and encourage you to change your future behavior, necessarily think that you went back and rethought this and then you saw that something was different and you get bogged down and all that. You simply get them to think, I could have handled this differently. And now in the future, I will handle this differently. So you become prospective about it in this sense. Now I don't have, yes, there's manipulation going on there, self-manipulation or other manipulation, but with the explicit goal of empowering you to do something that you want to do and giving you the choice to do it or not do it. So I think that one single move, if this is possible, obviates what is, I think, a terrible problem for all forms of therapy. It gives the freedom back to the individual. So I think, yeah, that's why I'm hoping this will work as an alternative proposal about how we think about the narrative practices in therapy. That's a great question because it's the one that bothers me most.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. This was exactly my question. I think you already answered, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper on that, because telling this idea that you don't believe in a stable self, it was exactly what I wanted to ask you in some way.
Yeah.
If the narratives constitute the self in some way, it's not a way, it's not a matter of matching the real narrative with what really happened, like we match a sentence with the state of things in some way. It's much more the idea, and I think that, at least in my experience of therapy of words in some way, is the idea that the possibility to re-author self-narratives is exactly what you look for in order to understand, in some cases, to build a narrative that is more suitable for you, that is more acceptable for carry on living, having a better way of handling your own experience. And sometimes you look for a narrative that is more closer to what really happened and to what you don't want to admit in some way.
Yes.
So it's much more a matter of modulation and sometimes of building a hierarchy of narratives more suitable of what you are looking for and is best for you, for make you feel better, or make you feel, having some improvements in your condition in some way.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that there's several things that stood out. I mean, I'll rehearse and come back to the idea of the stable self, which you mentioned. Okay. So part of that, you're absolutely right. This thought is that if it's got to be, so you could dial that down, right? And there might be something of importance in McConnell's and Snook's analysis if we dial it down, because the way that they kind of presented it, it sounded as if you could actually achieve that, or that others will help you to achieve the real. But you could dial it down and say what acts as a constraint there will still be what others. I think psychologically it's true that people will constrain you by telling you the kind of person you are. They will do this and remind you that you're not able to do this, right? This is these kind of disempowering, denigrating narratives that people encounter, but it can also be a stereotyping that one, takes in on oneself. All part of the idea in the background is the pivot is I'm a certain kind of person, right? Or something of that nature. So that it says, here's a truer narrative of you, right? And that you're self-deceived when you describe yourself in these and that ways, and somebody else objects and says, no, you'll never manage that. That's not how, what evidence have you got in your past? And so their whole idea of weaving in the threads was to find, and this is actually explicit, if I had more time to say it, in the narrative therapy, they kind of want to go back and find, they don't want to lie, so they want to find counter interests in your history. But here's the problem. You might start creating those under pressure, and it might simply be not the case that you have a lot in your back history. So here's a problem. Let's make it a little bit more concrete. Supposing X wants to be a different sort of person. The idea here is you somehow have to find the seeds of that new person in the past on this model and demonstrate the truth of it to be able to show it's a coherent narrative thread. Otherwise, you'll be told that's not going to be a very viable thread, so don't go that way. Right. And then you would say, well, maybe, and then with the previous question, maybe I should just self-deceive myself in thinking I'm that sort of person, even if I'm not, because it's going to help me. But I think this proposal that I'm making is say avoid both of those moves and say, look, if there aren't these stable, there are probably stable fixed narrative habits, and we have habits. Absolutely. So I'm not denying any of that. The question, which relates to the very first question, is can you shift those habits? Can you start to shift those? Can you reorientate yourself to a new future without having to have a past narrative that this depends on, right? So almost it's like a radical freedom idea. Can we break with a previous self? And is there methods for freeing us up which take us quicker to that, rather than having to convince ourselves of the truth of a previous narrative in order to make a new narrative or make new sense of our lives, right? So that's kind of the fundamental thought I have. And yes, it is very much tied to the idea that there's I think perhaps in this mix, a big job for philosophy to do apart from just the therapist, to actually maybe educate people about the natures of selves. Like that would make a big difference to people's ability to entertain these possibilities and take them seriously, right? So there might be another avenue rather than, so there's two techniques there. You might go back and find the actual instances where you have more evidence, and then you build up a story and you think it's more true, and then you feel more confident about the truth of it. Or you go the fast road and say, you ditch the idea of a stable self and you open the pathway for new narratives because you just think new narratives are possible on a more open-minded vision of what selves are, right? So two very different approaches. So, okay.
No, I agree. I totally agree with your last point. So thank you very much, Dan. In the meantime, there are 3 more questions. So we have Marina, Sean, and Anke. So Marina, can you please turn your microphone on?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes. So, sorry. Hi.
I can. Yes. Hi. Hello.
Okay. I thought because the screen was, yes. Hi. I don't know if I have a question that is like a question that I have some comment to do, and maybe you can say something, because on one side I have the impression that it's a nice move to think that maybe to orient more to the future, you give a certain kind of empowerment to the person to think and act differently. But on the other hand, I'm wondering about also the kind of harm that maybe this kind of I don't know if the therapy, but the more sure. the idea of thinking that the person has the freedom to finally change something when there are other kind of constraints that don't depend sure. on the person, right? So yes. Maybe when you imagine the following situation, like an addict person who wants to get a job, but now he has all this past and the people know about it, or maybe they suspect about it. So he's not going to get a job. And then he feels that, oh, okay, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to insert myself in society, and finally he can't do it. So, and even if he has this kind of positive thinking and future orienting narrative, so I don't know. I don't have a question, but it's just like a thought.
No, it's a good.
About this.
No, that there is a question in there, or rather a challenge, right? Which is good. It's a good challenge. I suppose, and I totally agree. You don't want people to be self-deceived. That's in fact the model, right? But let's contrast two things. One, which I am sensitive to, about what are the actual psychological. I think one of the objections to this would be, what are the actual real psychological constraints on people in the normal case? So I think a reasonable thing to say is maybe not everyone can achieve this, and we might have to look more detailed at that. But let's focus on the way you put it for a moment. I think the forward-looking projection, you're entirely right. I mean, it would be insane to say to somebody, look, you imagine something, therefore it's going to be like that. That's not the idea. So it would be totally unethical to encourage people to think that whatever they imagine, like I might well imagine in this scenario about my future, when the miracle happens and I have no problems, I'm sitting on a beach in Tahiti or whatever, and the chances of that occurring may be nil. That's not the function of this, is to say that possibility is realizable in some easy sense. It's to redirect people towards their goals, and also then to maybe get them to think seriously. I think to say that an addict can't get a job is too strong. Like, that's just not true. People who are recovered addicts do find jobs, but it's not easy. And so the path would be a realistic step towards the goals that they actually want to achieve, right? So I think this could be handled in an ethical framework as well. But the big difference, let me underscore it, is worrying about those future possibilities and their realistic nature didn't depend on us finding, which may not be very much in play. Equally, a counterpart to your way of thinking would be, let's supposing I search my past and I just can't find many instances that would make my current recovery narrative credible. That's pretty dismal. I mean, your chances, if that's the case, of getting out of that problem are bad. Like, you could just literally do a reverse version of what you said and say to the person, having looked at your life, you're not the sort of person who's going to get out of this, right? That seems a pretty dire statement, and it's possible, right? It's possible that that's the same assessment, you know, realistic assessment. Now, you might say that's also realistic assessment plays in anyway, but I think the idea that somebody who, and there are stories like this, and I don't think you might say, well, they don't generalize or universalize like crazy. I'm not making strong claims like that. This is not a fantasy picture, but is to say there are some instances where people manage to achieve goals simply because they set those goals, right, without self-deception, but with kind of a sense of those become really orienting for them in certain ways, and they find that the additional measures to get there. The point is, if you think you're a certain type of self, you can't even get in a position to set the goal, right? That's the barrier that I'm talking about in response to Claudio's question, and that may come up if you're trying to realistically assess your past rather than to orientate to the future. So that's, I guess, one of the guiding thoughts behind it. But I think it's a very good question that you raise, is to whether there are ethical issues about how you would engage in these practices so as not to mislead the gullible or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Marina. Sean?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. It's really, I think, quite nice. And without questioning that this type of procedure might work,
yeah.
I guess my question would be something like, what is the conception of the self that is sort of implicit in this? You talked about the open-minded vision of the self. I'm not sure what that means, but
oh, that's good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, sounds great.
If this actually works, if it's just about well, just imagine some future you, and does this in a certain way imply that the narrative constitution theory is actually right? All we are these narratives. I can just rethink this narrative of myself and zoom, it somehow or other works. Or is there something else going on?
Oh, definitely something else going on than that. I'm, as I say, I think that I'm on record for being critical of this narrative self-constitution view, even though I love narratives a great deal. But that's because I think too, and it relates to what you mean by the open-minded, fleet of foot, more enactive account of what I think a self is, and that's also in a paper with Jesus sometime recently where we got to it, where I think selves can be understood as dynamical, right, and completely enacted, embodied in the usual mode that I would standardly argue. So I don't think of them as and here's a spot where I could agree with someone like Strawson, and that's why not everyone has to have a way of narrating one's life in order to count as a person, right? That's just perhaps one way of doing it. So I think that taking the enactivist view of the self is a more basic one, where what an activist view of the self is quite embodied sets of habits, responses, tendencies. So, and that also allows that who we are could be quite distinct from the narratives we tell about ourselves, though the narratives we tell about ourselves are part of who we are, right? So the idea then is that if we were to flesh this out, and this touches on the previous questions, right? It's not like you just get to narrate differently. You have to enact a different way of being. And that won't, so I'm not suggesting that we reduce to a set of narratives, nor am I saying it's necessary, because you didn't hear me say it was necessarily possible. I haven't really assessed the possibility of this empirically. Like, I don't know how well this would work, but I think it does meet the other challenges, philosophical challenges, right? So the idea is worth exploring perhaps to see, and especially I think the pivot point is a barrier in these cases. So when I first read those studies, which I found really interesting about the potential connection between self-narration and addiction, the thing that stood out to me was actually most of all was that background belief point that I raised earlier. So I think that one of the things that might really be a major constraint is thinking about the self in a certain kind of way, and thinking that one has to give the correct narrative of oneself as opposed to simply becoming whatever that is going to be. And then, of course, you can tell a different story about yourself. So that's a very different way of looking at this. So I'm not buying the self-narration, strong self-narration constitution view. What I'm saying is we live, I mean, very much in the McIntyre mode of like we live our lives before we story them, right? And some of us story them and some of us maybe don't. And I think they have a certain dramatic structure, and you and I have discussed this before, that makes them right for narration, right? So we tend to focus on certain things, but that doesn't mean that we are narratives in some stronger sense. So the view that I take is, for all those reasons and external facts that were raised in the previous question, there are lots of things that are not going to be true of us. I also, by the way, I'm not attacking the idea of truth at all. I think, you know, I not a problem for me. The question is whether we could get at the truth of self-narratives. That was the challenge that was raised by especially past self-narratives, raised especially hard by the Rosenberg challenge, right? So, you know, what is our basis for that? Determining whether our, you know, what we know of our past is an accurate picture and therefore predictor of what our capacities are for the future. So, so that's the way that I think that obviously this would take a lot of fleshing out in terms of a detailed account of what an enactive self look like. We've done a little bit of that in some papers. I have anyway, and I think you, in our joint paper on this, have something to say about that too. So we touch on it, but I think it needs more development.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Dan. Angel, please.
Yes, thank you, Dan, for a great
you.
talk. It's nice to see where you took our paper, and yeah, I really liked your idea about the fictive stance. Like, if I look at your challenges, I think I'm not that worried about the scoping challenge. I think it's not for everyone, this kind of therapy and this kind of narrative. I think the advantages of the fictive stance is that you really invite people to be really creative, to really think out of the box, to really think in a different way about their lives, like really get the constraints out and really think what could be possible and how could I reinvent myself. And I think that's also a bit in the line of what Foucault and Agamben say about identity, that it shouldn't be that fixed, but that it's really free. So that are things that I really like about it. I think it can also help with the co-authoring, other people questioning the narrative. Like if you say, look, it's fictive, then I think that would help. But my doubts are, like for me, it's already in the concept of narrative that it's a kind of different kind of truth, and that it's not a kind of fact or the figures, but it's a different way of giving meaning or creating a truth. So for me, I don't need the fictive stance. For me, it's already in the concept of narrative. And what I mostly worry about is whether people feel taken seriously enough if you say it's a fictive stance and not if it's a kind of narrative recreation or narrative reinventing of oneself. And I'm thinking of one of the respondents we had that kind of almost died during an OD, and then he realized this was a very selfish act of me, like using drugs for so long. And he says, but in the core, I'm a helper. I'm a person who wants to help other people. And he kind of started narrating like all these stories about kids in school when he was young that were bullied, how he defended them, but also during his period of being homeless, how he defended a friend who got kicked out of church because they didn't want addicted people in church. So he was kind of rewriting his life through this idea of I'm a helper, and I think telling him to take a fictive stance in that, I think he wouldn't take himself seriously enough, and then it wouldn't have worked.
It's good, great comments. Great paper, by the way, from both of you. That was it really excited me. I wouldn't spend so much time looking at it. Let me think about that last point. I mean, I think the issue is, I think none of us have any doubts that, so I'll come back in a moment to your point about whether narratives imply or entail truth in some stronger sense. I certainly think, by the way, that quite a lot of people, at least in the analytic tradition, just think that they can, right? So even Goldie, very explicit on that. So there's quite a few people who work in that domain, and I think you'll probably find that with Shechtman and others too. So that's a point of contention in how you understand, or how we understand them. That's broader than perhaps this discussion. But that could make a difference. But then you're right. The really interesting question is, how does that bleed over into practice or in our practical lives? Like when we think about this. Sure, probably all of us. Funnily enough, maybe not funnily enough. Maybe this is very sad. Sadly enough, I think is the better term. I was in a management meeting yesterday, talking about, because for my sins I'm a head of school, and had to talk about change management and leadership styles. And of course, you know, when they make it really crude, there's a couple of options on the table. You're either an interpreter or a navigator. It's usually very kiddie based kind of options to sum up your whole style. As I pointed out to them, I don't think probably any of us have any one of these styles. Like, this is just very hard. But you can, right? Some people get into that and they can start to say they are this or that, right? And that can be okay. And we don't usually make hyper refined claims in those domains. What you're saying is that using that as a trope. So two things. One is that already maybe this speaks to your point, that already may be fictive in some sense for that person, right? So without anyone challenging them, I don't know, perhaps they weren't really as much of a helper as perhaps that's a commitment to being something like a helper, right? So here's another point, right? Perhaps we don't want to drudge through all of that. Was the point that I was pointing at the paper. I don't think we want to actually drudge through and establish or otherwise that that's true or not, right? Or have to put them through that to make that a credible part of the story that they want. Yeah. And the fictive stance, to pick up your first point, might enable you to say, that's great, you know. So part of that's lending confidence to them being a helper. The other one is, if they didn't have that in their backstory, somebody else, you might say, this is what I want to be, right? I want to be this kind of person, whether that's me or a different version of me in the past. Yeah. And maybe that is already. So your point about was whether they take it seriously. I guess the point I'm trying to stress is one can focus on the seriousness of the commitment to becoming versus the idea that we establish some truth that one already in some way is, right? And then I think that the point is that's the best case scenario too. The worst case is when, and that's much more common, I believe, people have a decidedly negative self-conception. Usually that's associated with this. That makes it really, really hard for them to move, right? Because that's the one that haunts them. So I think that the dangers maybe even outweigh this, but I also think that probably we don't know the truth of those kinds of things. And secondly, it might be sufficient to encourage people to think, yeah, that's great. That's what you want to commit to being, and then helping them on that way, rather than trying to reestablish that they are such and such or otherwise. And that's been the theme I've been giving in all the answers so far. But I thank you for that question. That's food for thought.
I think one other risk, if I may, Claudio, like, yep. I think people with addiction often have a history of kind of making other people believe certain stories about themselves that they're kind of not willing to commit to. Right. Like saying, oh, I'm going to change and I'm going to do this. And yeah. Like they live kind of double lives.
Right.
So maybe in that sense, the fictive stance can be a double-edged sword as well.
I see what you mean. Yeah, well, if it's obviously if it's used, how should I put that, as a device or a dodge, yeah, but then I think one has other problems, right? So I also think that, I think that the sense of, I didn't isolate this, but in your paper, the cases where this could have an influence for the better, there might be a small set of cases like that won't apply in all cases. So there might be a lot of other conditions. I wasn't trying to deny that or decomplify, make that less complicated.
What I more mean is, like, if you have like a history of telling those fabulous stories, and then suddenly you say, no, but this is the now I really want to commit to being a helper.
Yeah. No, I totally grasp what you're saying, and I think you're right. I just think that we'll distinguish that from a case of somebody who's better positioned, right? Yeah. So if somebody's in that situation, you're probably not going to get, we're not ready to take on the recovery road anyway, because they're still, whether they're doing that, like they would be doing that whether they took it seriously or not, if you see what I mean. So it's not as if that's a deal breaker for me about these uses. Look, I mean, I think a lot will hang, and maybe the positions are closer because of your views about truth and narrative than they would be for certain others, right? So perhaps that audience is directed at people who really buy into the strong sense in which the narratives have to be literally, because if you look, I mean, some of the quotes I pulled from the paper from you and Doug, there's stuff in there like standing with the facts, verification. There's a lot of coherence and correspondence talk. If you're an analytic philosopher, it rings in my analytic ears that's you know, part of the picture here. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks again, Anke. We have a question from Doug.
Hey, Doug.
Hi. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, thanks. Hopefully my internet's okay. I'm down for a little bit. I didn't necessarily disagree with anything you said, really. I was wondering, maybe, I don't think I would necessarily want to concede so much to Rosenberg, maybe because I'm thinking similarly along the same with Anke about how narratives can be true. But maybe, I guess what I was thinking is, what about the stuff in the narrative that you have of your past, even if you're suffering from addiction, that could be helpful for you? There's still good stuff in there. There's still some stuff in there that lets you know who you are, what you're capable of, that you need to draw on to make sufficiently realistic projections into the future that will succeed. So yeah, sure, that narrative of the past may not be true, or it might be one of several sufficiently accurate interpretations of what went on. I guess the concern is to totally abandon that would leave you at sea. So, I mean, you see where I'm getting at with this, that there might be, what do you do in the context of that? You need something to hang on to make sense of anything that you might do, but obviously you want to detach yourself from some of these more fatalistic
well, really good question. I mean, look, and so a bit of backstory, which I think you guys know, because Sean and I wrote the first version of this paper, and my first foray into this is very much to be excited by the narrative therapy in its original format, which basically does, and I think we were describing it, but we weren't critical of that aspect that you're just talking about, like going back and finding, and David Denborough is really keen on that. Like you find those little moments in the past where you can get that little bit of confidence. Look, I don't know if we have to treat it as a zero-sum game, but I guess we could do is bracket. The therapist could be saying, look, hey, wait a minute, and this maybe speaks to the previous question too. I mean, it might say something like, how can I put this? So, like, we don't know how, like, nobody knows how accurate or otherwise those accounts are, right? So they could be quite exaggerated, right? And maybe that helps, and as long as you don't press it very hard, right? So, but I think I was struck by the dangers. I'm very taken by what you say about the co-authoring. So I think I'm struck by the dangers of the co-author coming in and saying, that's baloney. That's not the case. You're not that sort of person. You never did, highlighting all the counter cases that makes the person diminished. So if it really hung, so I'm really reading strictly in the first part where you had the two strands, right? Which I thought was a great analysis. But the point is that if that's the case, then I think of it logically. I've got to have enough of that strong strand or I'm doomed, right? Like I just, if it isn't there, like it could help, but if it really isn't there, and I have to buy it and I have to believe it, it may turn out in a lot of cases that there just isn't enough in the tank to make that credible, which is a kind of dim outcome. And perhaps the thought here is, if we break with that thought, Maybe that won't work for all cases. Maybe there's two things you could do here. You could explicitly talk about this in the mode that I just did. So the therapist could be saying, look, we're not trying to get at the truth of what happened in your past or something like this. But even if we all know that it's not really easy to know what the truth is from things that happen, but maybe you can remember some things that you think, emphasis, or you want to describe that, or elaborate, that capture the sort of person you want to be, right? Something like this. Maybe there's a way of presenting that doesn't commit them too much to an overly strong, truth sensitive account. You could perhaps present it in, tell me a story about your past where you think, there's some element in which you capture the sort of person you want to be now, or something like that, right? So there must be a number of different complicated devices that could be used to bracket that, so we don't get overly committed to, and thereby avoid the manipulation challenge. And look, I mean, it would be a much longer conversation about. I don't think Rosenberg is some font of truth on these issues. I just raised the challenge. I spend a lot of my time fighting with Rosenberg on and challenging his claims. So that's definitely not like I'm taking him as somebody I think he's wrong about so many things, but that's not. But I think the challenge he raises here is fair in that we always have more than one interpretation of past events, and especially in these kind of cases, we're not going to be able to pin it down. So if the therapy depended on doing something like that, it's in trouble already, right? So I want to move us, and that's conversation is doing that. I want to move the needle away from that way of describing it and thinking about it into these softer ways of thinking about it, so that you think, okay, well, that's okay, but which also doesn't in any way mislead the patient or take people down the path of self-deception and all the rest of it. So now, whether that's all possible and keep the goodies, right? That remains to be seen, because this definitely is a work in progress. I mean, I only got to the end, and I have more questions than I had usually in a paper. Maybe that's because it's a serious topic, right? So maybe that's, the different. It's not a philosophical maneuver, right, or a purely philosophical maneuver. So yeah, I think that's right. Was there something else in what you said? Yeah, no, I think that's what I'd want to say. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I mean, I certainly just to come back just for a moment. Yeah, I like that way of looking at it. The goal of this therapy is not to get at the truth; it's to recover, right? So I think that's kind of part of striving this. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Doug. Then, just a curiosity, in order, maybe it's a silly one, but in order also to discuss about things that we discussed in the previous series of the seminar, during the weekend I've watched a Netflix series about Ted Bundy, the serial killer. Okay. If you remember.
I think so.
Yeah, and maybe the question comes from the fact that I could not sleep at night because it was a really strange subject. But in some way, it used to tell that I choose to be polite, I choose to be calm, I choose to be skilled in empathy. Yeah. So there is a way he was not, because he chose to be like that. Maybe something that, but there is also a way he was in some way, because he was showing that to the people and all that. This kind of behavior for you is a narrative, and is of the same kind of, of course it's not a therapy contest in some way, but it's something that there's something in common, which this idea of reauthoring self-narratives in some way.
Right. So yeah, I mean okay, there's a longer, and this is useful. Okay, so if you can choose to do X and you can be X for whatever period, I get what you're saying. So if you can elect to just do that by playing a part, even, you might say, this kind of relates to Sean's question. Now that's, you could truly say of yourself that you're able to do that, and you can do that under certain circumstances, right? That would be part of a true statement even about you, I think. So I'm not I'm just saying that in terms of the accounts that we give of ourselves, we edit, we select, we miss things, right? So that's part of the way that I think the hope that the original version of the reauthoring lives by is that there's a whole lot of capacities that if you look back at them and you reminded yourself of the circumstance. So I think they see the abundance of the past ways that you were as having lots in there that you could just refocus on. So that's how they tend to want, the standard method was go back and find those things in your past, not just like your capacities that you haven't exercised yet, where you sort of did this a bit, and then that will give you some basis for rethinking and reauthoring your standard narrative about yourself. So if you think of this, the narratives, which I do, as a created about oneself, right? Open to challenge by others, and therefore you could describe them as more or less accurate in this broad sense, even though I was pressing on this, right? So if you imagine this from a kind of, God's eye view, the narrative you tell is either picking it out or not. We're never epistemically in a position to know like how much and on whether, we want to get into that kind of weird picture of a metaphysics where we could talk that way. The idea is simply that you may have untapped capacities to do certain things, right? So let's make this concrete. So let's take this as a good case. So let's take it as, let's say Bundy, it has these abilities to, under certain circumstances, exhibit empathy, right? Or the show of empathy. Imagine he's not in a position to know that, like that's the, but it's part of his design. Like many of us, right? He might decide to make that effort, like picking up a new skill, right? That's part of it. And sometimes it's just having the confidence that that's possible. And that might be not requiring having previously done it or having previously done something like that in your past. That's what I was getting at. So perhaps sometimes shifting our ways of being and what's possible for us may outstrip the things that we imagine are possible. And we may be pushed down in that because of certain, it's more likely that we're pushed away from certain possibilities because of certain narrative tendencies that we have currently. That's the idea. And so any pathway, I guess the broader picture is any pathway that pushes you away from the restraints of a current way of thinking or current narrative will suffice. Hence the fictive stance model was maybe there's a way to shift us into the future-oriented thing without necessarily having to go back and locate that and build it into a story. So that's really the key, I think, of what I was getting at, because the other version does suggest that you kind of always need to find something of that. Otherwise, that the narrative won't take. It's kind of like a fire. It just won't take. It won't burn. It won't stay. And maybe this is my enactivism, right? Maybe this is me thinking you've got to lay down a new path walking, right? So there's no path there. Maybe there's not even a trace of a path, but it's still possible to tread a new path. And that's the kind of thought that I guess is driving this. And it is a very enactivist thought that it's possible to it's possible to tread a new path and thereby develop a new credible narrative about oneself, right? Where the self doesn't reduce, to answer Sean again, to just your narrative tendencies. So I don't know about Ted Bundy more than that. So.
Thank you. I think that there are no other questions. And if this is the case, we have to say thanks to them and to all of you for the huge amount of questions. There is Luigi. Luigi.
Oh, Luigi.
Luigi.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, Luigi.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk, Dan. I have just 2 quick questions.
Okay.
The first is about your idea of narrative self-shaping and how it works. That is, in which ways can different narratives act upon and modify our imagination and emotion? That is, do you think that there is a common structure, like we semioticians think, between narratives and imagination that can make this translation between the 2 dimensions possible? Or if there isn't, in which way this translation can happen? And the second question is how your position can match or not recent account of narrative medicine that underlined the importance of the narratives in the hospitals, in the relationship between doctors and patient, etc. Because I think that in narrative medicine accounts, we don't have the same strong idea expressed in narrative therapies, but more focused in a practical way, in the way in which narrative can help a recovery. So do you think that your account can help in this context, or no? Thank you.
It's very good. The first question is, I mean, I've written a lot about imagination and narrative. I think that imagination is a distinct let me be clear. I think there are different forms of imagination. Some imaginations are particularly narrative based and some imaginings are not. So that's very much in my basic and contentful mind's view. A common structure as such, I wouldn't necessarily say so, but there's interactions, of course. And I think it's, for me, you know, and that kind of relates to the previous questions. There'll be a lot of necessary, I think, hand waving about. If you ask me, like, which are the elements that connect, that's going to be very complicated and in many different cases, right? So I think that obviously there are lovely questions about in what sense associate imaginations and other things that we have fuel our narratives and vice versa, right? So I think the interaction point is well held, but I don't know that I want to posit something like a common structure. Maybe I misread that, and maybe the semioticians do a better job. But of course, in my world, common structure usually means representational, cognitive, computational mechanism, or something like that. And of course, I'm going to resist that in favor of a more responsive model in tune with an enactivist account. So that's depending on what you mean by that question, right? So. But I think that one can go, you know, it's a great topic to investigate, and I have done a little bit more on the nature of imagination, and now some new papers on pretense, right? So asking how those two things interact at different levels would be a very important thing to do. Your second question, remind me, the focus was going to be on the second part of your question is. What was it again, Luigi? It's early for me.
I think Luigi has some connection problems.
Hi, hello?
This was about the narrative medicine and the relationship between...
That's it. Yes. Okay, yes. Look, I've written a little bit about that in other contexts. I think that the typical line there is that getting the individual story, like there's different strengths of that account, like, but the very most minimal one is that you're going to learn something important about the person that you can't just from taking charts. So taking time to hear someone's story can make a difference. I suppose that narrative medicine, of course, we're talking about in many cases, much less to do with the mental health scenario. Like a lot of cases, it's just going to be bodily ailments and stuff like this. But some of the examples that I recall from the work there was that you learn something diagnostically important by listening to the story than trying to fit everything straight into a standard stereotype of what you race to assess. And you learn perhaps about the real situation of the patient, independently of bracketing everything else. So I do think that narratives are, that's really important. That seems pretty obvious to me, and there's some documented cases that it works very much in tune with the narrative practice hypothesis, horse's mouths principle. So in the same way that you ask about people's reasons by looking to them, you might talk to them about what their medical history is, where the medical history isn't just broken down to what's occurring in their body and where the point of the pain is, but the background story about what happened and how they're acting and what's happening, because that gives you greater diagnostic clues, right? So, but that would be quite different. If that's what we're talking about as narrative, that's obviously an important narrative practice, but not the same one as the kind of narrative-based therapy which we've been talking about today.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we really have to say thanks to them for answering more than 1 hour of questions. So
yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it means that it was important, and people perceived it as very important. So we also thanks to the 24 people that are still connected at midnight, at least in Europe. So thank you very much, and we have to recall that our next installment will be Vittorio Gallese on 24th of May, so it will be Vittorio. It will be the 24th of May. So I think that we can say good night to everybody and say thanks again to Dan, and wait for Vittorio's talk in 20 days.